Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming live at you again from Film Fanatic headquarters. It is about 11:08 on a Wednesday morning here in the great city of Northport, Maine. Hope everyone's doing good. Thanks again for people adding, the continued flow of new subscribers. It's been really very cool to see, and I always find it as I always look at that as fuel for me to keep this thing going, and it makes me more excited that might always be a small audience, but it's enough to where I feel it's important, and that there's other film fanatics out there that kind of care about a lot of the crap I have in my head. So I really appreciate that, and I love that there is some kind of attraction to that and to these ideas, even if it's small. But again, it's something that at the same time, I think I've always been a proponent that, really virtually anything is possible. There everybody goes against has these things in their lives where there's hurdles, or there's these roadblocks that we all go through, you know, through personal situations, and then also, we want to call artistic situations where we hit like a roadblock, and where we feel like, well, we're in a rut, or we can't really get to that place that we're envisioning. And I feel that at the end of the day, I don't know, as I've gotten older, I've just learned to kind of embrace those adversities, like the roadblocks, the all of the things that at face value seem like they're maybe doors that are being closed, in your journey. It's a funny thing that my mom's always has always said ever since I was a kid, and I feel like it's a thing she's always said, but I really feel it's a true thing. I think it is something that I definitely aspire to always adapt that kind of view. And she, would always say, even when I was a kid, you know, one door closes, another one opens. And so over the years, I've always felt like, particularly around the projects and things that I'm involved in, that I'm involved with now, and then also, especially in the past, where I had a lot less experience on how to navigate through things, personal things, and then also artistic things. But a lot of, like, speaking on in terms of like some of the projects I've been involved with over the years, like more original based projects, music projects, and what have you. The projects that I've always been involved with over the years have always been things that are always had tremendous amounts of adversity around it, meaning that it was never really a thing. Certain groups I was involved with during that time, we there were virtually no, like, say, for places for us to play, or venues for us to play. There were virtually none, or none, or zero places for that would have the kind of music that we were doing. There wasn't, there were no places that would have music that, to a degree is on the fringe side, whether it's like on the rock side or on the electronic side. Things that don't easily fit into a category, or they might be a little bit on the fringe side, a little bit on the experimental side, or they have this edge. So it might have, to a degree, some kind of commercial appeal, but at the same time, it doesn't have that appeal at all. And it's a, and the other whammo, or the other component of that is that that project would always be all original based. So I always found over the years, like especially early on when I first kind of got into my own original project, there were no opportunities. Like we literally had to a degree, kind of create our own reality, and that really was incredibly hard. On one hand, it was really fulfilling and really something I could really get my energy up for. But at the same time, there was all kinds of adversity as far as trying to figure out like a weird, like a almost like you're in this puzzle box, like trying to figure out how can you create this or how can you do this that have a venue or create a venue or create that space or create maybe an audience when the things that are provided for you or the things that are already out there wouldn't really have you there, or your 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 material just would not be uh, welcome there. So it always, and a lot of it has to do with the whole old school DIY kind of punk rock aesthetic. I grew up with that kind of thing in my DNA, where you try to you have to think outside of the box about 90% of the time and how to do things. There isn't that conventional thing. For instance, if say I played music right now, for instance, if I played music where it was more in the traditional sense, like when as far as when it comes to original music, if I played music that was based on maybe a lot of covers or music that was acoustic based, or it was in the vein of like say Americana or like traditional American folk, or if it had like say a country flair to it with a rock kind of vibe to it also, and it was a balance of like some original tunes but then probably predominantly acoustic cover tunes per se, like that, there's automatically those venues, there's automatically a bazillion places that you can play and that you can get your voice out there with. The stuff that I tend to do on my own and projects that I've worked in and bands I've worked in the past don't really have any connection to that at all. So it's always forced me to really think outside the box. And in a lot of ways, it makes things a lot harder. It makes things a lot more challenging. But I've also found over the years that when I do kind of break through that wall a little bit, and I do have, even if it's small, and then there's been times where it's been on a, a big example of success, I feel like it's kind of instilled a higher degree of work ethic on me, and I've or within me. I've learned to over the years, instead of being facing those things like a bull, I've kind of come to the conclusion over the years to almost kind of embrace those things and to like try to figure out in regards to how to navigate through that stuff, through like problem solving. And I really feel, it's instilled in me a different kind of work ethic. And I'm proud of that. But then it's, and there's like a sense of, and I feel like people can really create their own reality to a degree. They can really, through a lot of love and passion, if things are from a sincere place, you can kind of create that reality. That's and in a lot of ways, like I said in the beginning of the show, I think in some ways things are, anything can happen, and I feel like when someone has that focus or drive, you can create that reality, and anything can really happen. And I don't know, I try to apply that philosophy and that general way of how I think about things to everything. And I've learned over the years to just kind of embrace those things. And in some ways, I almost feel that adversity and those things are kind of needed in this weird kind of matrix kind of a thing. I look at it to times of like say the punk rock movement or the hardcore movement. During say the late 70s or especially the 80s during the Reagan during the time of Reaganomics and when Reagan was our president, and things were very, very conservative, and things were very clean and very pristine culturally, and suddenly there was this dark kind of underbelly, not wanting to conform to that, and that gave birth to the punk rock scene and the hardcore scene. And I often think, and there was a lot of adversity, extreme, almost a higher level of adversity for those artists of the time. And I also, and so I've learned to think that like, well, if those artists were not under those conditions during that time, would their music, would that scene, or would that art be significantly different? Would it have that edge? Would it have that fire or that passion? And I often think of that, like maybe to a degree that's kind of needed to put fuel on that fire, to really think outside of what society traditionally tells you to do, or society tells you this is what you need to do. So I kind of look at it as this matrix, almost like a matrix kind of scenario, and I think it's true. I think not only that movie, the Keanu Reeves movie. I think the basic principles of that movie and the philosophy uh, are totally steep in reality. But I think in real world application, I think that to me is like a personal example of that. So it's a balance. I feel like there are those things of adversity and are all those things, but then that can lead to really high levels of creativity. So I don't know. It's something I always think about, and often I think of that period of music, particularly like just for example the punk rock movement in the 80s, that it probably it might not even exist, but I think maybe that genre or that whole kind of renaissance of artistic expression probably would have been radically different if it wasn't for those kind of harsh conditions that that kind of created that. So it's an interesting kind of thing, and so I always part of that for me. I've just kind of agreed, just over time have just learned to embrace those things. So and that's also with pertaining definitely to this channel where I do a lot of movies that are not maybe covered or movies that are quote unquote popular or fit into a particular category. And so there's that also. So yeah, it's an interesting kind of situation or situations that I often think about. But I kind of feel like overall those are for the kind of the end result of a lot of cool things that eventually come out. So today's show, I'm pretty excited about this show. This is a movie, you know, I've often said many times my favorite genres are horror and science fiction. Most of the movies I cover on this channel have been in those two genres, especially with horror. And I realized as much as I love science fiction, I have covered quite a few science fiction films, some newer ones and some older ones, particularly a lot of the exploitation movies. They all have a lot of those films have some serious component of science fiction, and a few have been full-on science fiction movies. But I don't know. I sometimes feel like maybe I don't cover enough of those kinds of things because that's one of my favorite genres, especially when you take horror and science fiction and combine them. Like for me, the ultimate example of that is Ridley Scott's Alien. So I was thinking the other day, well, maybe I haven't really covered full on, got done enough coverage on full on, science fiction classics. So this is a movie that I feel is one of those iconic movies that really changed cinema and really changed, in particular, the genre of science fiction, and that is Forbidden Planet. This movie is just such a masterpiece. And I feel like this movie is definitely one of those iconic movies that definitely changed the scope, the whole genre that we know now as science fiction. It changed it back when it came out, and especially now. And I feel like this is one of the most influential movies in one of my most beloved genres of science fiction. And this came out in 1956. It was directed by Fred M. Wilcox. I bought this Blu-ray. Geez, I bought this probably about maybe 4 years ago now. And I had a little bit of a history to this film. I definitely saw this as a kid. It was on cable a lot. I probably rented it a few times back in the VHS days. And I definitely had a history with it. I I was always been enamored by futuristic films based on like futuristic concepts. I've always been enamored by, the use of like technology in films. And this is one of the most defining films in the genre known as science fiction. This stars Leslie Nielsen, the amazing Leslie Nielsen. What an iconic actor. As a kid, I knew him from the Naked Gun movies, like which are some of the best comedies ever. That's what he was older when he did those films, and I don't know, he's probably most well known for those films. He did about three or four of those films, and they're great, comedy classics. He worked a lot with Mel Brooks, the great genius director and writer. He he also worked in a whole slew of these really low budget exploitation movies. And Leslie Nielsen is an incredible actor. Like he really has, after growing up and seeing him in all the Naked Gun movies, I always pictured him as just being this like silly, goofy, kind of actor. But throughout the years, he has done so many great dramatic roles, so many great movies, and his careers was just incredible. And he's just, he's one of the stars in Forbidden Planet, and he is just amazing in this movie. Um, Anne Francis is also one of the leads in this movie. Another fantastic actress. Walter Walter Pidgeon, another fabulous actor in this movie. So many great actors in this movie. The the most interesting thing too about this movie that I always forget, and again I watched this again last night, is that it's actually based on a Shakespearean play, The Tempest. This is actually based on the original work of Shakespeare. And I always forget about that, but it's put in obviously a very futuristic, science fiction based world. And it's got a real high concept to it. The the thing that I'm always taken aback, this Blu-ray edition for this film is just amazing. It's totally jaw-dropping. There's scenes in this film where it is just the art direction is just incredible. Like it is kind of jaw dropping, and to see the scope of how on such a grand scale that this movie is told is really inspiring. I feel like this movie, obviously, I think it's one of the most influential sci-fi movies, but I can think of movies even more recently, like say movies like Interstellar, Christopher Nolan's movie, which I really love. A more, that's a fairly recent sci-fi movie. How that was so influential, how Forbidden Planet was so influential on a film like that, in a real, in a real contemporary, for a very contemporary sci-fi film. There, I mean, just the amount of influences. The Killer Clowns from Outer Space is another one of my all-time favorite exploitation movies. But there's so many shots and things taken from Forbidden Planet for that movie, Killer Clowns from Outer Space. And I've seen interviews with the filmmakers for that movie where they talk extensively on how this this classic was such a go-to movie for them growing up. And the music, it's got one of the greatest science fiction scores I think ever created. I have the soundtrack for Forbidden Planet, and it's just so cool. It's like one of the coolest soundtracks, one of the most creative, and also like it's so oddly unconventional, and it's not commercial. It's like all of these weird kind of ambient sounds. It's very creative. It's not conventional by any means. Like there's not any conventional melodies per se or structure. It's really wild. And this package is great. There's so many wonderful special features on here. There's hours and hours. There's a really huge documentary where they interview Ridley Scott, James Cameron, so many popular directors, and they all talk about George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, and they all talk about how they really owe so much to this film. And think when you think, or when I think that this film came out in 1956, like it's unbelievable, because I definitely consider this movie to be like an epic classic B movie. I definitely consider this to be like a sci-fi exploitation movie. But the thing that really separates it from a lot of other science fiction films is the quality of it, the way it's shot, like, and that it's also based on classic literature. So it definitely puts it, even though it has a lot of those tropes of like the classic, 40s, 50s exploitation, sci-fi B movie, you know, things, or the taken from the aesthetics of of that world. It's so beautifully shot and so beautifully directed, and that it's based, and also the biggest component of it is that it's based on a William Shakespeare play, The Tempest. So it really has this real elevated quality, even though it is very campy and silly and pretty cheesy at times. But because of the story and the narrative and the high level concepts behind it, it really is an elevated version in that genre. I think it's one of, probably the best overall quality film, that's in that B movie, was in that B movie world, especially in those two decades, like the 40s and the 50s, especially the 50s. In the 1950s, there was like, probably thousands of all of these campy like exploitation sci-fi movies that came out. And also, one of the biggest directors of that time was Ed Wood, who I love. He was notorious for making all of these incredibly low budget sci-fi horror movies, particularly sci-fi movies that are just, amazing. And they're just, classic movies. But this Forbidden Planet is like is part of that world, part of that whole decade. But it's elevated. I feel like it's elevated, and it rose to the top because of the sheer quality of how it was crafted, and because of those elements of which I mentioned. So it has, it stood apart, even though it's part of that genre, but it stood onto itself, and I think that's one of the reasons it has such an influence, with so much sci-fi that we see today, even today, like decades and decades later. It's like amazing this how far-reaching this film was, as far as how many directors it's influenced, and the high level concept behind it, where it's it's a really interesting story. It's centered on this whole kind of concept of the these id monsters, where there's like a real deep psychological framework behind the kind of the villain, Dr. Morbius, and it's a really interesting and real intellectual premise for this movie. And I feel that too is another example why the whole story was elevated, whereas traditional the traditional storylines for a lot of those, for the decades of, in the decade of 1950, of the 50s, a lot of the stories were, not so serious. They're really campy and kind of silly. But again, another example of why this film is like an elevated version. And I definitely feel like sci-fi, the science fiction genre as a whole, like especially then, but then especially now, probably even more so. Without this film, I think sci-fi would be significantly different, and probably less creative, because they really pushed the those creative boundaries and their kind of explorations of ideas in that genre through this film. Just amazing. One of the most iconic movies ever made. This, and again, this packaging is just amazing. I think I bought this about 3 or 4 years ago, and it's the transfer of this like is unbelievable on Blu-ray. It's gorgeous. There's there's almost, the thing is that's so funny about it is, even though it came out in 1956, like there's obviously a very dated quality to it, but I think it makes it cool. But from a visual perspective, it is timeless. Like it really is. Like in some ways, it feels, even though the budget is like minuscule compared to say a sci-fi movie, maybe a big budget Hollywood sci-fi movie that would come out now, it's nothing in comparison. But the way it was shot and the level of creativity that was captured on screen, I feel like this movie is, when I like, again, I watched this last night. I've seen this a bunch of times, and I was just really taken aback by how incredibly timeless this film really is. Like it's kind of unbelievable. There really isn't, a dated quality. Maybe with some of the delivery of the dialogue, you get that sense that this was done in the 50s. But outside of that, you don't really see that. And it's a really funny. There's a lot of cool humor in this movie too, but then it has a very serious um, story also. It's a great balance, and it's just a great sci-fi, and it messes with your expectations. It doesn't go into this typical thing of where, around the concepts of discovering life on other planets. It's a very interesting exploration of those ideas. I love this movie to death, and it has like 3 or 4 hours of special features on here. Like it's insane. It's crazy. So I highly recommend it. If you've never seen this film, like this is one of the movies to see. And you know like I said, they have interviews with like Ridley Scott and all of the great directors, especially at one time, all of the great directors that made a lot of classic sci-fi movies. You know, case in point, Blade Runner by Ridley Scott. I really feel like if this movie didn't exist, even though Blade Runner is significantly a different kind of a movie, I definitely think that this was such an incredible influence on Blade Runner. And Blade Runner probably, if this movie was never a thing, I think Blade Runner would significantly be a much different film in a lot of ways. You know, whether the way that movie is structured, or the way that it was shot, or the scope of it, the cinematography. This movie was such an integral part of influencing, you know, just Ridley Scott alone. So it's a real key component to loving science fiction. So yeah, please check this out if you've never seen this, especially this edition. It's like for me, it's always like seeing it for the first time. Like it's just gorgeous. The transfer is just beautiful. Everything. So this is Jason Dean. Thanks again for checking out my channel. If you like these videos, please like and subscribe to them, and keep the comments coming. I really appreciate. I really love interacting with other film fanatics out in the World Wide Web. So thanks again, and we will see you next time. Peace.